My name is Anna Kutkina, and the title of my book is Between Lenin and Bandera, Decommunization and Multivocality in Post-Euromaidan Ukraine. So I wrote this book mainly, it's been quite a lengthy journey. It's been almost 10 years since I got this idea to write this book. It started originally when I was working with the Canadian International Development Project in Zaporizhia, which is eastern Ukraine, and it was all the way back in 2010. So when I was there, I became interested in studying similarities and differences of different regions of the country. So 2 years later, I started a doctoral program at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And this is when the book kind of emerged into what the reader would hopefully see very soon. In 2012, I started this project, and it was about regional differences of civil society in Ukraine. And then in 2013, as we all know, the world witnessed the Euromaidan revolution in Kiev. So it was at that point I was still in Finland. And all I had was media and some articles, which of course I kept reading passionately every single morning as I would wake up. And at that point, there were two major narratives. One being the Russian media propaganda campaign saying that Maidan and Ukraine was just a group of a bunch of nationalists. And on the other hand, we had the Western or Ukrainian narrative, which said that Maidan was the space of that included all Ukrainians. And personally, for me, it was a bit of a puzzle because as a person who was born and grew up in Kiev and moved in Canada at the age of 15, I kind of had a little bit of a tension buying both of these claims. So what happened was that I took a camera and I decided to go to Ukraine and discover what is happening there myself. Eventually, it ended up being 4.5 years long ethnographic research, and now it turned out into a book which examines decommunization of Ukraine beyond passing and implementation of the laws. Basically, what I'm looking at is how poster exhibitions, renaming of the streets, toppling of the statues, how this space become a canvas for meaning making and articulation of different meanings that involve, interestingly enough, that combine and involve both nationalist and democratic symbols and values that are being narrated nowadays as decommunization. Yeah, so in my book, I use them interchangeably, but of course, originally, desovietization is a much older process, which started all the way during the Soviet Union and again at the different levels. Now, the real decommunization of Ukraine that we're talking about in this book is, of course, the new process that began after the Euromaidan revolution as a national phenomenon. We have to remember that decommunization at the early stages has, of course, started in the early 90s. But again, it was more of a regional phenomena of Western Ukraine. And to the extent that we are talking about it nowadays, I would say that decommunization, it's a new thing in Ukraine, which again, maybe we will talk about this a bit later, is a highly multi-layered and complex process. So I think the bigger question here, which is very important, is what do we mean by decommunization or desovietization? Are we talking about toppling of the statues, passing of the laws, and how do we define decommunization at the mentality level, for instance, at the grassroots level versus the state level? So the way I came to tackle this whole process was, again, I arrived at Euromaidan when it was still very heated issue and everything was happening there. And at that point, in documentaries, in academic articles, there were a lot of statements about decommunization, starting with the toppling of the central Lenin statue in Kiev. So for many Ukrainians and international observers, symbolically speaking, that was the point when it actually started. Now, what my research came to uncover was that I think, and this is crucial to remember and define it in such terms, is again, when we talk about decommunization nowadays, what are we detaching from? Decommunization in the 90s, what was a pretty raw phenomena, because there was a real communist party back then, real Soviet Union and stuff like this. When we're talking about decommunization now, I think what happened in Ukraine is that with the military aggression from the Russian Federation and occupation of Crimea, decommunization obtained different meanings. So yeah, we toppled the Lenin statues, but people filled in this empty space with different meanings. And this is exactly what I'm talking in my book. So the first stage, this is how I defined this, was actually, and I find it very interesting that it kind of went on a little bit, I think, unnoticed in the academic sources and media, is that as a space of the revolution, people came to Maidan to express different meanings. And I'm talking about this in my book, citing the strike poster exhibition and Ya Krapля v Okeani, I'm a drop in the ocean. These were all the voices that claimed to detach from Russia, obviously, to detach from the Soviet past. And these are the voices that filled in the Lenin, the toppled space, with different meanings. And these meanings involved fighting corruption, overthrowing Yanukovych regime, and fighting for the European Ukraine, for a different future. Then what happened later is already in summer of 2014, when I was in Kiev, I noticed this kind of a massive filling in of the empty space with the nationalist symbols. So very rapidly, and I think here I would agree with Marpels, with scholar from Canada as well, who was saying that this whole process, it became kind of a very quick step forward. So the government filled in this space with the nationalist symbols, passing the decommunization laws, while at the grassroots level, the process took much longer than 6 months, as was expected, and it was filled in with many voices where people tried to preserve the statues. I'm talking about graffiti, how there was this ongoing dialogue between people and the state, and contestation and the meaning making, which involved a lot of layers outside of, again, just passing the laws or getting rid of the communist symbols. So overall, we have to remember that Ukraine was the space of the highest concentration of communist and Lenin statues as the country, as the Republic of the Soviet Union. So if we compare Ukraine to Russia, in geographic terms, Ukraine had over 5,000 Lenin statues itself and communist statues. So the toppling itself was a pretty noticeable phenomena. And again, at the early stage, and my book captures the time period of 2012 and 2018. So I'm only talking about this time framework. What is happening now is a little bit of a different story. So back then, in 2016, 2017, when articles started to come out, and we had seminars about decommunization, there was a lot of debate on what is really happening there, because again, visually speaking, you would see two types of toppling. One was the so-called nationalists, so a minority group would attack the monument, smash it down, and this is it. And the official removal of the statue that came out a bit later as the laws were passed. And that was, again, the state implemented phenomena. Now, when this was actually my puzzle at that time. So we would hear claims that there was no objection to the removal, and at the same time we would hear claims that there isn't a real support of the removal either. So I was wondering to see what was actually happening there, because nobody was, people were talking about facts, but nobody was talking about the actual process. So at that time there were claims that people were okay with the removing of the statues because they were too busy in like getting ends meet in financial terms. Artists and activists were saying that it's probably not the best time to make such a massive decommunization when the country is at war. And again, there were a lot of different claims. What I think is interesting is that if you look at the grassroots level, there were so many instances when people took the monument personally and took renaming of the street personally. And the reason for that, and I think Kiev would be a great example of this, was that, and this is being documented is in the film which is called Euromaidan Rough Cut, which I think is a prophecy in itself. So someone filmed the Lenin statue being toppled, and you see the local Kievan lady going to the people who are toppling the statue and saying that you do not top your own symbols. You come to my city and topple my Lenin, which is a memory for me because it was the place where I went to school. So all of these little narratives kind of went unnoticed. And my research has shown that they do exist, obviously, and the fact that people are not articulating these claims publicly, or maybe they're not given enough space to articulate these claims, doesn't mean that they're not there. But again, what my book is talking about is this diversity itself, of course, is there, and it doesn't mean conflict. This is also an important point to remember, that different voices may be contested, but it doesn't mean that Ukraine is divided through this. I think that for them, Lenin is nothing but a symbol. And it is a personal symbol. And again, Lenin himself, if we talk about Lenin, I don't think him as a figure was as evil as Stalin, for instance. He died pretty early until before all the massacres that Stalin did to all the repressions began. If you were to take Lenin as a figure, like detach him from the political context and look at what he was saying himself, he was actually against the empire as a original step, right? He came to overthrow the empire. Another question is how history evolved afterwards. So I think for these people who support the statue of Lenin, it is an act of nostalgia about the Soviet past. I do not think they understand who Lenin was. I'm not even talking about the younger generations who oftentimes in Ukraine or Russia have no clue who Lenin is at all. So we are clearly talking about older people for whom, again, he is a symbol of if they are supporting him, he is a symbol of the glorious Soviet past, victory of the Soviet Union in the World War II, and so forth. And if we talk about Ukraine as it is nowadays, there are a lot of claims in academia as well that the reason why we do not hear those pro-Lenin voices is because physically Donbass is occupied by the Russian Federation. So even if we were to hear these voices, we cannot do so physically because we just are not in touch with those people. Now, what I can tell from my own experience when I was conducting interviews with the internally displaced people from Donbass and Crimea, even though those were young students, interestingly enough, you could kind of sense the division in the group, in the class, that some students were still not pro-Russian, but they were very careful about, again, those new Ukrainian symbols, and others were openly saying that, yes, we support Ukrainian pro-European course, we support the decommunization. And so I think, again, at that time when I was there in the field, the picture was extremely complex. I would say that the people who were for Lenin, they were very explicitly against Bandera, to the point where one of the interviews, this girl was saying that she started dating a man who was pro-Ukrainian and who showed up in a shirt with Bandera, and father said, no way you're marrying this guy. So it's like such an intense family divisions were still there. When we talk about the other way around, I think what is important here is to remember that after the Euromaidan, and this is again what I'm talking about in the book, is that the nationalist symbols, they kind of lost their original meaning as being exclusively nationalist symbols. So you have Bandera or OUN or UPA as a symbol that is not fighting the communist past anymore, and this is important to note. They are fighting they are extracted from history to fight modern Russian aggression. And so in these terms, these nationalist symbols, they do become more democratic. And I think for that reason, the objection towards this symbol is, as the process that is going down, is very logical, because again, people maybe either consciously or unconsciously are identifying these symbols with the current war rather than communism, which doesn't exist anymore in its classical terms. Yeah, so the reason why I draw such a distinction between culture and politics is, again, I'm talking about the whole process as hegemonic meaning making. So at the state level or political level, the hegemony or multivocality is pretty explicit. So we have a state which is imposing or proposing decommunization in a very solid form, such as laws or renaming of the streets, and eventually, sooner or later, these laws are being passed. Now, when I'm talking about cultural process, that is a much more complex thing. So in one of the chapters, I'm focusing on graffiti and political posters. So when I would arrive in Kiev, I would see the poster exhibition, which is presenting war in this a little bit of a romanticized, very similar to Soviet poster terms. And when I went very close, much closer to the poster, I would see that on top of the poster, people are writing messages. So you would see something like Revoluция Гідності, which is the revolution of dignity, and then someone writes Revoluция Вигідності. So it's like people are acknowledging the fact that this whole decommunization, de-Russification is not eventually as simple as the government pretends and says it is. So it's not a clear-cut thing. So when I talk about culture, I mean that if we look again at the regional level, and if we do the regional mapping, we can see that the graffiti, the posters, they reveal the dialogue that people are stepping up and expressing their views of what they think about the current government and the past and the future. And in this sense, these views, I argue, they are very cultural, in a sense that they reflect not only political stance, but cultural affiliations, being language, being, again, the family someone grew up in, and so forth. So when I talk about culture, again, I'm not talking about division of Ukraine into Western and Eastern Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking. I'm talking about how this cultural genome, how people still follow kind of traditions that they grow up in their families, in their schools they went to, in the regions they come from. And again, all of this at the different level is what decommunization is all about right now. I sincerely, believe it or not, really like what President Zelensky is saying from the very beginning since he came to power. I'm a big fan of his New Year's speech, for example, that he gave in 2000. And I listened to his speech for the 30th anniversary of independence. And I think things what he's saying, I would put my signature under every single word that he's saying in those speeches. I also strongly believe that Ukraine is a multivocal state with a lot of identities that together do form a unified state. So if I were to advise him on decommunization, I would probably say that since the laws are already passed and we probably cannot change much, I would probably I would do a survey across the country and see what the situation is like at the ordinary people's level. And if there is a space for putting symbols that are of personal value for these people, I would probably suggest making space in street names, in again posters, in the visuals that would be representative of diversity of Ukraine as a state. Like when I started the research, I was following my gut feeling there. So I knew that it's not as black and white as it was portrayed in the media. So in this sense, I was actually nicely surprised that to some extent I was right, that the picture was a much more complex one. What caught me by surprise, okay, I will be very honest, I didn't buy the argument of Russian media, of course, but as a person who grew up in Kiev at the time when Kiev was still pretty Russian speaking, I came and decided to test the hypothesis myself. So one of the instances of such a practice was that when I was at Maidan, I came to one of the guys who had the right sector symbol on his arm, and I just asked. I thought, okay, everyone is saying that these people are against the Russian language. So I asked him in Russian, how can I get there? And that reaction was very surprising for me. That was the nicest response I've ever seen. So the guy was like, Kvitochka, Zirочка, he took me where I wanted to go and he helped me out. So in this sense, yes, what caught me by surprise, again, as a person who wasn't living in Ukraine for quite a number of years then, I was surprised to see how the division between Russian speaking and Ukrainian population was gone by then, even though it was 2014 then. And I was surprised to really feel how unified the country got so quickly after the occupation of Crimea and war. So these 2 points were probably the most unexpected ones for me as a researcher, again, who came from abroad, who was both an outsider and insider for the country. Okay, yeah, so this book I think is important because, again, it was written as an academic scholarly statement, but this book is about the people. So I think it's unique in a sense that it exposed the ordinary people's voices, and it tracks quite a number of years as well, so 4.5 years, and it includes a lot of visual data, interview data, photographs, graffiti, and I think as a general statement that hopefully the reader will get after reading this book is that Ukraine is a living statement of a democratic state which even though is still going through the period of transitioning, detaching from the past, the country that is going through extremely tough times still, it is a statement of possibility of having diversity, which is not divisive, which is not like divisive and splitting up the state, but which is rather unifying. And I think this point is should hopefully bring optimism to scholars, political scientists, ordinary public who reads this book, because it is a book about with the message of hope. Maybe, yeah, I could talk a little bit more about the, which is the kind of a final core chapter of the book, where I'm examining the process of, again, construction of this state narratives versus people's narratives. And what really caught my eye when I was there collecting data, it was very interesting to see how visually and discursively there was this process of kind of a construction of a struggle of a Ukraine as a state, as an ongoing 100 years old phenomena. That was something that was pretty interesting for me to see, because of course we had moments of peace in Ukrainian history, and if we look from 2000 from 1917 until 2017 when I was there, it was fascinating to see visually how they made those political posters where you would see the UPA army, for example, marching smoothly from the black and white color to a colored picture of soldiers in ATO. So this kind of visual construction of a struggle being an 100 years old phenomena was a very new thing for me as a researcher, and it was very interesting to see people's reaction to this. Like, I would just stand there and observe how carefully they would read the text, and overall it was also pretty captivating to see how Kievan Rus was also integrated into this narrative. So it kind of, so the national identity of modern Ukraine is now being constructed all the way from Kievan Rus to war in Donbass, as a kind of a process of an ongoing struggle. And this is something also that President Zelensky mentioned in his speech this August. So I think it's probably, to that scale, it is something new. But again, it is fascinating to see how it doesn't trigger aggression in the society, but it rather triggers commemoration and unification of Ukraine as a state. Yeah, Kievan Rus and Volodymyr and all these symbols, they've been part of this ongoing tension between Russia and Ukraine. So obviously Kievan Rus is a sacred space in history and in the genetic code of the Slavs, as President Zelensky was saying. So this is definitely a point of fighting over as a sacred source of national and cultural identity. So in Ukraine, I think since Ukrainians know that Kievan Rus is the Ukrainian thing, I think all we can say is that they do treasure this as a part of who they are. While for Russia, I think in simple geographical terms, it's a little bit more difficult to claim that Kiev and Rus is Russian. So for them, I think it's a bit more of a bigger fight over it as a symbol. And when it comes to the statue, I mean, I was actually in Moscow years ago when the statue was erected there. And funny enough, my very pro-Russian friend was very proud of the statue to be there. And another Ukrainian friend who was there, the person was just, silent, because kind of we know the truth. This kind of assumption is that you can, no matter how loud Russia exposes and says that, Kievan Rus is ours, I think Ukrainians know where it belongs to, and it's pretty obvious that it is from Kiev. So Well, right now I was working on different things this year. So I finished my doctoral research. So this book is based on my doctoral research. So it was adjusted from manuscript to a book. Right now I was actually interested in working on displacement itself. So I would ideally, after the pandemic is down, I might go back and do more research on the internally displaced people. And I, as a researcher, there are a lot of there were so many people whom I spoke with, war soldiers in Donbass. I would really love to do a research on what happened to those people who came back from war, because they are they're given medals, their families are given those acknowledgments and stuff, but the real stories of these people, I think they're not really studied yet to the extent that they should. So ideally, if I had a chance, I would love to do that and see how they see the war, how they see what is happening in Ukraine nowadays. Because even when I was in the field back in 2018, the same soldiers whom I interviewed in 2016, they were saying quite different things about war and their memories and reflections 2 years later. And again, this unfortunately, besides the Ukrainian sources in English-speaking academia and media, we do not hear much about them. If you want to hear a very honest opinion here, exactly what you said, this is what was happening. So people, the soldiers whom I interviewed who came back from war, they honestly speaking wouldn't, I mean, maybe I just ended up talking to people like that, but those whom I spoke with, the scale of politicization of this whole phenomena went down to the point where only thing that they were concerned for was their health, to be very honest. And their wives who were there taking care of them in the wheelchairs, they were telling me openly that they get that much money, which is not enough to survive on a daily basis. So with some of them, I didn't even dare to ask what they think about politics and decommunization and the statues, because that is something that is so detached from the level of their daily concerns. So unfortunately, and again, that was in 2018. Of course, when we talk about politics, and it doesn't matter if we talk about Ukraine or Europe or North America, there is a discourse of the politicians and there is a real situation of the people. So to some extent, of course, decommunization and toppling of the statues was a necessary act, necessary visual act. But then if we talk about whether toppling of the statue in the village in Poltava had a direct impact on the quality of life of the citizens there, of course, obviously, it has nothing to do with economic situation or the military situation. It's a nice political act, even cultural act from the state or the people who topple the symbol. But of course, if we want to really improve the quality of life of Ukrainians, we definitely should turn towards the economy and physical safety of the citizens and stop war in Donbass and make sure people are physically safe. And afterwards, probably, again, once those basic needs are being resolved, we can really talk on a serious level about renaming, toppling the statues, and so forth. But it happened already, so there isn't much we can do. But ideally, I think that would be, if, as you asked earlier, what would my suggestion be? My suggestion would probably be to have a little bit more of a balance between the rhetoric and the action. Uh, when we talk about such things in Ukraine, finding the best who would please everyone is a bit of a challenging task. So what we saw, for example, in Kiev was that the local authorities reached the point where they will rename the streets based on the trees, for example, or the flowers, just to lower down the tension. So of course, Taras Shevchenko is probably the most Ukrainian symbol we can get, who wouldn't have much objection on any of the sides. And in these terms, I guess artists, poets, they would be the most appeasing symbols to come after Lenin is gone. But I think another interesting phenomena that is there right now is that the very central Lenin in Kiev, his pedestal, the fact that it's still empty, I think that tells us a lot about how long it takes us to decommunize the country. And also, I don't know if you were following that much, but how that pedestal was the space for artistic installations like a golden toilet of President Yanukovych, all those funny things where people would make a statement that we know that there is corruption. We know what this is all about. So once Lenin goes down, it doesn't mean that all of these issues fade away. So it is again, it's a evolution of meanings, and this process, I believe, is such that might take quite a number of years, at least at the mentality level, to reach the point where we could say that it's completed. Absolutely, yeah. Oh, what is the core thing here is that they are definitely the protectors of modern Ukrainian state now. So they are putting in line. They're being put in line together with modern Ukrainian fighters, soldiers, artists, volunteers who went to fight and protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So they are being carried as symbols, as visual symbols, and through this act they are definitely losing their original meaning, and they become the so-called empty signifiers, and they obtain new meanings of being protectors again of modern Ukrainian state. And interestingly enough, this phenomena, again, whether it's being acknowledged or not in the society, this phenomena is also welcomed by Russian speaking fighters who go there. So irrespective of the background of the soldier is marching now, saying glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes, which is originally a nationalist slogan. So without, again, maybe consciously acknowledging this, the symbols are being transformed into a symbol of modern fight. So in this sense, absolutely, the Bandera, OUN, UPA, they are not the figures who are fighting the Nazi regime or the communist state or Poles or Jews or whatever claims are being made there. They are extracted visually, but again, they obtain absolutely new meanings nowadays. Thank you so much, William. Thank you. До побачення.